Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we're treated to a masterclass in the history of nuclear strategy and statecraft by Professor Frank Gavin, Chair of the Texas National Security Review Editorial Board. Gavin explains how he was drawn to the study of the history of nuclear strategy, logically enough, by the study of balance of payments, but he also discusses some of the central challenges associated with studying this question. After all, the threat of nuclear weapons has been central to U.S. and indeed global strategy since 1945, but so much about these weapons is based on unproved or unprovable assertions, absent the horror of the instance of their being used once again. Gavin's discussion is wide-ranging, identifying what he considers to be the most important and most challenging unexplored questions, as well as the central issues associated with it. This talk was given as part of the Summer Seminar on History and Statecraft, hosted by the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin, in Beaver Creek, Colorado. Let's listen in.
My talk will sort of fall into three parts. The first will be how I got into nuclear history, because as I kidded Will, I got into nuclear history unexpectedly. I've been trying to get out of it for about a decade. Every time I think I'm out, it pulls me back in. The second part is why it's challenging to do nuclear history, why it's actually been methodologically and substantively a difficult subject. And then the third thing, I was going to give you an overview of what are the four big questions you need to think about if you care about nuclear weapons. Now, the first point is how I got involved in nuclear history, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but as Will mentioned, my dissertation and my first book was on international monetary relations. And Charlie very kindly mentioned a piece that I've written recently on economics and national security, and it was kind of my first love, and I fell away from it. And so, the question is, well, you say you want to get out of nuclear history. How did you get into it in the first place? And the interesting issue is, and this is, I think, historians here will understand this, but it's a good thing for political scientists to hear. I basically went where the documents took me. I didn't go in to become a historian of nuclear weapons. I started out doing a history of post-war international monetary relations, which then got me focused on the question of the American balance of payments deficit and the loss of dollar and gold. And as I looked through the records on this dollar and gold outflow, which really alarmed 4 consecutive presidents, if you look at some of the things that people like Eisenhower or Kennedy said, this was a first order issue to them. And they said, look, how do we end the dollar and gold outflow? And when they would talk to their colleagues from the Treasury Department or from the Council on Economic Advisors, they said, there's one account that is generating greater dollar and gold loss than any of the others, and that is the costs of U.S. troops stationed abroad and their families, particularly in places like West Germany. And in fact, not only were they expensive, the countries that the U.S. was protecting were the ones most likely to get dollars and turn them in for gold, namely West Germany, Japan, but also France. And so these issues became linked, and there was a big discussion where the presidents would say, Eisenhower said this, Kennedy said this, Johnson said this, Nixon said this, pull the troops out. If they're the ones threatening the health of America's international economic position, well, let's get the troops out. Now, when I would see these documents, I went back and thought to my undergraduate days, a really long time ago, when I was studying international relations, taking a class with John Mearsheimer called Strategy and Arms Control, and all about the doctrine of flexible response. Supposedly nuclear strategy changed, and the whole point of the strategic change in the 1960s was that the threat to use nuclear weapons massively on any number of contingencies had lost its credibility. So you needed more conventional forces. So the kind of potted history one learned was that in the 60s, the U.S. spent more on conventional forces. And here was in the record, presidents saying, get these troops out. Like, I don't want to see a collapse of the dollar on my watch. And then when you followed the debates, when you ultimately saw why the troops didn't leave, or they left in less numbers than the presidents would have preferred, it was not because of the strategy of flexible response. And in fact, it had, which was a strategy that was, in terms of vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, not really taken very seriously at all. You say, okay, in fact, they said the Soviets aren't coming in the 1960s, and if they are, conventional forces aren't going to make the difference. You say, well, why did the troops stay? Well, they had to stay to reassure the West Germans. Well, why did you have to reassure the West Germans? If these troops were pulled out, there would be enormous pressures on West Germany to acquire their own nuclear weapons. And so as I dived into the records, you saw this link, starting with international monetary relations, moving to balance of payments deficit, moving to U.S. military strategy, and then the decisions about that military strategy being based not necessarily on the efficacy of the strategy versus the adversary, but reassuring the ally, who the United States, for any number of reasons, and I'll talk about a little bit, had decided could never get its hands anywhere near nuclear weapons because that would create World War III, which then generated a variety of things, including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so I just basically followed the documents and ended up telling a story, which it was interesting because, and I'm going to talk about the sort of community of nuclear scholars, most of whom know nothing about this history. And even one of the reasons I don't get out is I keep writing it to try to remind them, and it doesn't sort of really sink in. If you go in Washington and say, look, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was essentially two enemies, the United States and the Soviet Union, working to screw over their friends, namely West Germany, and for a while China, even though that didn't work, but others, and put it in forms of an international treaty because they realized discriminating against Germany had not worked out very well in the interwar period, so let's have a global treaty instead. They look at you like they're crazy. So that was how I got pulled into it. And for historians, you'll understand this organically, right? You just follow the documents and it leads you to a place of surprise and unexpected insights. For political scientists, this is important because most of the people who wrote about these subjects were political scientists. Most of the people I engaged with, there was a whole community of international political economy scholars, people like ranging from John Odell and Susan Strange to John Eikenberry to Jonathan Kirshner, and they wrote about America's foreign economic policy and international monetary policy. But they didn't write about nuclear proliferation, and they certainly didn't write about America's NATO policies, and they didn't write about the connections between nuclear strategy and non-proliferation. Then you had people who would write about non-proliferation, and the idea that you would talk about the balance of payments, they think you're absolutely crazy. And even the non-proliferation people, if you said the reason that the United States had the nuclear strategies it had, which were forward-leaning, often focusing on developing capabilities that arguably were destabilizing and really only made sense if you went first, there was a reason for that, because the only reason you could guarantee non-proliferation was by guaranteeing the security of the people you said couldn't have the bomb, and the only way that was credible was by having a willingness to go first and have capabilities that made that somewhat credible. And so, and policy makers know this intuitively. They know how all these things link up. But for political scientists, they often say, well, I might study nuclear proliferation, I might study U.S. foreign economic policy, I might study transatlantic relations. But in fact, historians know as they go into the documents that these things often end up getting integrated together, and you can't understand one without looking at the other. And this was, Will had kindly mentioned a concept of horizontal history that I developed, but the sort of linkages between all of these issues. And that's how I got pulled into it. And it's one of the great joys of history. And there's any number of other subjects that, and I know the historians in the room understand this. The second, and this is the reason I didn't want to stay in it and I can't seem to get out of it, is it's a particularly hard set of issues to study. Why is it hard to study? I mean, we know nuclear weapons are of profound importance. We know they've remade international politics. We know they implicitly and explicitly shape American grand strategy. But there's a big question, in what ways and how can we know? And there's at least 5 reasons studying nuclear weapons is really, really difficult, and answering these questions is hard. First, it's a technologically sophisticated, complex set of issues. You have to understand some science and engineering. I taught a course last week with Hal Brands, and we had a brilliant nuclear engineer, Marina Snowden Robinson, and she was just explaining all that goes into the design of warheads, that goes into the design of their delivery capabilities, all the things involved trying to measure blast and radiation effects and fire effects. And it's an extraordinarily complex set of technologies. The second is, and I'm sure Elizabeth can back this up, these are some of the most difficult documents to get at. They're deeply classified. Ironically, it's often less about your war plans against your enemy and more about what you're saying to your friends. Right? I got very good over the time to figure out, okay, that little redaction clearly is West Germany, and that little redaction is Israel, right? One of the I once lucked into a treasure trove of documents in the Kennedy Library, Roswell Kilpatrick's personal papers that they had forgotten to redact anything from. And not only did they have great insight, but they provided sort of the key for figuring out how things were redacted, because then I would compare them to the same version and others. And it's like taking a standardized test. You figure out these patterns, but it's very, very difficult. I know Phil is left, but I know Phil has been trying for maybe 10 or 15 years to get this extraordinary history that was done by Ernie May and John Steinbrenner of the history of the Strategic Arms Competition, which is this incredibly valuable document, which you just go for 30 pages and it's all redacted, right? And so what's in there is just gold. And I know he's been trying to get this thing declassified, fully declassified forever. So that's the second big issue. The third big issue is an ethical dilemma. How do you talk about these weapons? Are monstrous, horrendous, murderous, catastrophic weapons, and their use would be an indication of the greatest failure in human history, right? But how do we talk about them? This is Elena's terrific work on thinking about jargon and thinking about, when I was reading about what she was working on, it made me immediately think of the nuclear field, where we use very sterilized terminology: deterrence, damage limitation. I mean, damage limitation is just a euphemism for first strike capability. And first strike is just a euphemism for launching a nuclear war, right, on your own first. And it's how even developing language to talk about these issues is very, very, very difficult and challenging, because on the one hand, we all have a sense as scholars that as we try to approach some level of objectivity, that certain types of language might undermine that. On the other hand, we have to always remember the reality of the horror of these weapons, and it's really difficult. That leads to the fourth challenge, and that is most of the people in this field are, this is not a polite thing to say, but they're actually advocates parading as scholars. And I'd say a high percentage of the people in the think tank world, but also in the academic world, have certain views of how the world works and should works. And basically, when they make arguments, Charlie sent me something really interesting about this discovery of these silos in China that had been undiscovered, that a private sector satellite firm had seen. And this big Twitter fight between Matt Kroenig and Vipin Narang, both friends, about all this, and a lot of people saying a variety of things. And I can tell what they're going to say ahead of time, because they're making arguments about they're advocating their worldviews. And some people believe that disarmament is either a moral or instrumental imperative. Other people believe deterrence and strategic stability is extraordinarily important. And there are others who believe, well, you need to have a war-fighting capability. And none of them can prove their case, which leads to the fifth point, because basically what we're all doing is a history that, thank God, never happened. The only thing that matters in this field is trying to understand why a thermonuclear war never happened. And for the political scientists out here, I was talking to one of you about a piece I'd written about some of the quantitative literature that's been done by political scientists in nuclear studies. And the only ends that matter are 9, 2, and 0. There's 9 nuclear weapon states. There's 2 uses of atomic weapons within a week of each other by the United States against Japan, and then 0 thermonuclear wars. And it's interesting, even on the 2, we've seen more and more evidence that there was a third bomb ready. Truman said, after he finally started getting details of what happened, he said, these can never be used again. And what's difficult is that the question we're trying to answer is about something that didn't happen. And as all the historians know here, we don't agree on the things that did happen, right? If I was to say, let's have a conversation about the July 1914 crisis, like, we would not agree. We'd all see the same documents. We'd all see the same thing that actually happened. We would have big arguments and fights about causes. In the nuclear field, we've had something that hasn't happened. And we're trying to understand that and trying to observe, measure, and analyze a phenomenon that's never happened is difficult, if not impossible. This is why people make a variety of claims, and they can't prove them, fortunately. And most of the arguments in the nuclear studies world are proxies for this question of why we didn't have a thermonuclear war and how we could continue this. And it's frustrating to be in a field where you can't say anything certain. And it's also frustrating because even though there is an enormous literature on these questions, all the questions are the same and they're unanswerable for the most part. And to the extent that they're answerable, they're often more reflections of different people's views of how the world works, which is fine, but they're rarely explicit about it. Which leads to the third part of my talk, and the one I'm going to spend most of my time on, and like, what are these 4 questions? Right? It's actually really intimidating if you said, okay, I want to learn about the nuclear studies field. I want to understand nuclear weapons and American grand strategy. And you would start looking, and there's this incredibly large literature and this very intimidating set of scholarship by some of the leading intellectual lights of the post-war period. And you say, oh man, how would I even begin to get into this? Well, the good news is there's really only 4 questions that covers about 90% of it. And they're very basic questions. I'm going to kind of go through them with you now. And it's, you sort of get a handle on these 4 questions. You can go on Twitter and debate with Matt Kroenig, should you choose to. So the first question, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is, how do they work? It's the technology question. And obviously there's technology, there's engineering and science. There's also some politics here. The history of the United States' decision to build an atomic weapon is a fascinating one. It was not inevitable. It's involved actually very important grand strategic decisions, an enormous amount of resources, and it was used, in fact, it affected, as American policymakers debated what their grand strategy should be, how many army divisions they should have, how they should fight. The decision to build the atomic weapon had a big effect on those. And the weapons were ultimately, it's a fascinating story. It was mainly scientists and engineers who had escaped fascist Europe, the absence of which the United States would not have been able to build it. It was, they were built to defeat Germany, and the bombs weren't developed until after that. And there's a whole set of questions about what was actually going on there. But there are 3 questions on the how do they work front that people often don't think about that I kind of want to highlight for you. We often focus on the nuclear revolution of 1945, but in fact, the real big revolution was the thermonuclear revolution. The development of the hydrogen bomb in the early 1950s, its ability to cause an order of magnitude greater destruction really changed the game. As people wrestled with atomic weapons, fission bombs in 1945 and beyond, there was still some thought that these were just really, really big bombs that could be used as normal ordnance in a war. And by the time you started developing thermonuclear weapons, people recognized that was just not possible, that one bomb dropped accurately could wipe out a city, and 10 could wipe out a country, and that a full-scale nuclear exchange could have consequences that, given that we're not entirely sure of the environmental consequences, could wipe out civilization. And so that was the first big technological jump. The second big technological jump is to recognize that, in fact, most of the issues surrounding nuclear competition since that time have not been about the nuclear weapons themselves. There's been some, but not a lot. In fact, building atomic weapons at this point is a relatively old technology and not where the action is. Most of what the United States has spent its effort on is the technology and how the weapon is delivered. And enormous sums of money are spent on accuracy, speed, stealth, flexibility, miniaturization, and then things like safety and control. And in addition to the ability to deliver the weapon, building extraordinary systems of command, control, communications, and intelligence. Think of things like anti-submarine warfare or the development of satellites, right? It turns out that the United States spent an enormous amount of money and resources very successfully being able to do something people thought was impossible, which was to track Soviet subs anywhere in the world. And they spent a lot of money on it, and there's a whole series of questions about why they did that and what the consequences of it were. But those are the sort of things that matter in the technology front. When you think about nuclear modernization today and the debates about spending over $1 trillion in the next 30 years, the money is not going to be spent building more bombs or actually bigger bombs. It's going to be on the ability to be more accurate, more stealthy, to deliver it in different ways. And then the whole infrastructure, the sort of nuclear system around them, both command control, communications and intelligence, safety, all the stuff that goes around nuclear weapons. So when you look at the technology, you want to think about that. The third technological point is that even though obviously these weapons haven't been used, the technologies that were developed often had enormous consequences in other fields. We all mentioned Governor Clements and the second offset. A lot of the technology, some of it was meant for conventional weapons, but a lot of the research and resources spent on what we might think of as counterforce capabilities, the stealth, the accuracy, was able to be translated into conventional force uses, which, as Will mentioned, people saw in the first Gulf War. And it goes in the opposite direction, too. We're now in an age where new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, various cyber capabilities, people are starting to wonder how that will affect the nuclear mission. So that's the first big question. How do they work? What's the technology? How do we understand that? The second big question is, what is their point? What is their utility? What are they good for? And this is nuclear strategy. What role do they have in American grand strategy? Now, as I said earlier, they were first developed as a weapon to win a war against Japan or against Germany. And they were developed after that war was already over. And there's a big debate, as the historians here know, about when the bomb was used against Japan in August 1945. Was it used to defeat Japan? Was it to send a signal to the Soviet Union? What would a war have looked like against Japan absent the use of the atomic weapon? It's a fascinating and really important debate. But then that period ends and people start asking themselves, what are the point? What can we do with these weapons? What do we do with them? How do they advance American interests? And it fell into three broad categories, and it still falls into three broad categories. This hasn't really changed. The first is that the bomb, it's a military tool, it's a military instrument. Military instruments are used to win wars and to defeat adversaries on the battlefield. And that's how the atomic bomb was originally conceived. It's a much bigger bomb, But people thought, sure, we could use this. And there were all sorts of different ways people thought about this in terms of tactical nuclear weapons, and battlefield nuclear weapons, and weapons shot from tanks and from even handheld, the Honest John, shot from individually held things. But immediately a lot of problems came up from this. First, huge moral implications, right? And we can talk about this, but people recognize this was not like a normal weapon. If any of you ever have an opportunity to go to the museum in Hiroshima, it's extraordinary and moving, you very quickly realize that the consequences, and when you start studying the effects of the bomb and how people would die, people killed by the blasts, first of all, but then the deaths by radiation and the deaths by fire, which are sort of torturous and more long drawn out. Some huge moral implications. It's also instrumentally how you would use them. If you are, because you can develop technologies to mitigate some of this, but you are essentially destroying whatever territory it is you're defending or trying to take over. So that issue sort of faded away, although it lingers still because there are people who believe you need to actually have nuclear warfighting strategies for the next two purposes, even though they don't really believe you should use them to fight them, right? This is sort of people like James Schlesinger, and today people like Rob Sufer and Bridge Colby, who are like, yes, you should be able to demonstrate that you can use these things on the battlefield, even though when you push them, they're like, oh my God, we would never use these things, right? The whole point, though, and this gets to the second and third points of using them. The first is to deter, right? Very early on, people realized that, well, and what is deterrence? Deterrence is just preventing somebody or some entity from doing something that it would otherwise do. And the interesting thing here, and I'll get to this at the end about whether nuclear weapons are good or bad in the long run, if you think about how one wrestled with nuclear weapons, say, in the 1950s, if you looked at recent modern history, you'd say, what was the great challenge that any state faced? It was fear of being conquered, fear of being invaded, fear of being colonized by an imperial power, right? Pretty much modern history, almost since the beginning, but really intensifying with the rise of Europe from the middle of the 17th century through the middle of the 20th century, the sort of desire to invade and conquer and colonize various territories was what drove international politics. Nuclear weapons immediately solved that problem. They are invasion insurance. If you have a nuclear weapon and you can kind of keep it safe and make sure nobody gets it, you really decrease the incentive and possibility anybody's going to invade you, right? Because if you threaten to drop that bomb on one of their cities or several on their cities, if they invade you, then it suddenly becomes clear that it's not really worth invading you. And so on that front, from basic deterrence, and this is one of those ones, again, I said earlier, you can't prove this, but yeah, it's pretty logical, right? You know, up until 1945, wars of invasion and conquest, murderous, fully mobilized wars were a major feature of international politics, and they went away. And so deterrence, obviously, was one of the key factors. Now, there's a tricky little question here, right? When you think about the United States, nobody was going to invade the United States, right? There's been no threat of an invasion of the United States since the U.S. Civil War and the possibility that the British might intervene from Canada. And pretty much from 1865 on, if the United States had no nuclear weapons during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was not going to, the likelihood of them invading it in some massive amphibious invasion was not very likely. And what U.S. grand strategy tried to do with nuclear weapons was to deter adversaries from moving against their friends. And so this is the whole issue about extended deterrence. And almost 90% of the debates around U.S. grand strategy and nuclear weapons surround this question of whether it's credible for the United States to promise to use its own nuclear weapons and also expose its own homeland to attack in order to defend its far-flung friends around the world. Now, I have been one of these people, and this gets to the language point. We call this extended deterrence. I actually think it's something different. Like, I mean, if you threaten to sort of do something bad to me, and I say, well, if you do that to me, I'm going to respond immediately by punching you in the face, that's obviously credible. If you threaten to do something to Will and I say I'll punch you in the face, you know, Will and I are good friends. I may do it or I may not. But if what you're threatening, if you're bigger than me, you know, maybe it's not that credible, right? Like, and so it's not the same thing as deterrence. And so extended nuclear deterrence is where a lot of the action is. This relates to a third controversial question. Those people who said, hey, can nuclear weapons be used to do more than just deter? Can we not only prevent people from doing stuff to us, can we get them to do things they otherwise wouldn't? One of the great ironies, and I get in a lot of trouble in the nuclear community with this, and I wrote a little bit of this in an intro to TNSR about Tom Schelling, who at the same time was talking about trying to make nuclear weapons less dangerous by ensuring mutual vulnerability and strategic stability, wrote a book, you know, that was Strategy and Arms Control, then wrote 2 books around the same time saying, how can we take advantage of nuclear weapons to get people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do by manipulating risk, the threat to leave something to chance? Because basically the United States has relied on nuclear weapons to do far more than others. And occasionally we have been interested in looking as to whether, you know, nuclear weapons can be used to change behavior. Now, this is a big, tricky subject. One of the other things I've tried to push on the nuclear studies community, which they never seem to buy, is that one man's deterrence or one woman's deterrence is another woman's compellence, right? It's not always clear. You look at the 58 to 62 period of crisis, you could make a case that the Soviets were trying to compel the Americans to leave West Berlin. But the reason that the Soviets were doing that is they believed, with some evidence, that the Americans were trying to give nuclear weapons to the West Germans, which what they were trying to do was, you know, so to the Soviet mind, it wasn't clear whether they were trying to compel a change or deter a change. Right, and the same on the American side. It gets very tricky figuring out sometimes what is compellence and what is deterrence. So those are all the sort of basic uses. It's very controversial. It's controversial today. At the heart of the difficulty of this is if you want to deter or compel or extend deterrence or do any of these things, both implicitly and explicitly, it's based on your willingness to use these weapons. And when you spend some time thinking about nuclear weapons, except in extremis, there's really very little willingness to want to think about using these for understandable reasons. I've sort of come to the conclusion, and it's a very hard thing to figure out, but that most presidents, from Eisenhower about sort of in his second term, certainly including Kennedy, Johnson, even Nixon, certainly Reagan, just had no interest in ever using these weapons. And I can talk about that in a little bit. But on the other hand, if your grand strategy is based, whether it's extending deterrence, whether it's compelling people to do things on nuclear weapons, you have to credibly demonstrate that you might be willing to use them. And this is, again, a whole set of issues. It's one we're going through now. I mean, it was very interesting. And I know, Randy, you were involved in Phil and Bob Blackwell's Taiwan scenario, which was fascinating that they did for the Council of Foreign Relations. And they never mentioned nuclear weapons, right? And the whole thing. And I said, well, and I asked Phil this, and he said, well, you know, it's not important enough to use nuclear weapons. I'm like, well, if we're not going to use nuclear weapons over Taiwan, like, when are we ever going to use them, right? When Mexico invades? I mean, that's not happening, right? Like, you know, it's the same scenario when you think about the Russians in Estonia. Like, this is exactly why the U.S. developed nuclear strategy, to deal with these scenarios where they were both extending deterrence and also faced steep conventional challenges. And we don't, the fact is that we actually don't want to use them. We're probably not going to use them. But that's kind of a problem since our whole grand strategy is based on it. And that's a whole issue that's sort of not going away. One little side note, how do you study this stuff? How do you figure this stuff out? So the history of U.S. nuclear strategy is actually, it's a really tricky thing to get at. I came to the conclusion that there were actually 4 separate histories that were somewhat connected and somewhat disconnected. And depending on which history you looked at, it would shape what you thought was going on. So the first history of U.S. nuclear strategy is what I call the Wizards of Armageddon history. And this is the history that your classic IR class, your sort of intro to IR or your intro to nuclear studies class would show. And that's basically the bomb's invented, you've got a bunch of military Luddites who don't know how to use it. You've got these brilliant intellectuals and professors at places like Rand or the University of Chicago and Princeton, and they invent all these wonderful concepts. People like Tom Schelling, Bernard Brodie, Albert Wohlstetter, Herman Kahn, and they show the world how nuclear weapons should be thought about. They develop the concept of strategic stability, and they save the world. This is literally the most self-serving history you can imagine, but it's the one I'd say was how most people learned this probably till, I don't know, maybe the mid-90s. And it's also highly inaccurate. There's actually very little connection in many ways between what the people at RAND said and what was actually done. So the second history, which is, okay, all right, I can't believe the professors, I get that. Well, what about what American public officials say? John Foster Dulles, he gives this big speech in the Council on Foreign Relations announcing massive retaliation. Robert McNamara goes to the University of Michigan during a graduation and talks about no cities, which, by the way, can you imagine if you're bringing your grandmother to your graduation, and you've got this guy talking about how we're not going to blow up cities. I'm like, whose idea was this, right? What a great graduation speech. At least now presidents have the good sense to do this during West Point graduations, but you can imagine, you're just, you're like, go Wolverines, and all of a sudden Robert McNamara is talking about how we're not going to target cities in a nuclear war. And grandma's like, well, what's happening? And so, or Schlesinger when he announces the Schlesinger Doctrine, or Obama during the Prague speech. You say, well, all right, well, there it is. That tells us what we're doing. And when you look into it, you actually realize that this is true in many things in the history of national security, but it's particularly true in the nuclear weapons field, where the actual public rhetoric is at a great divide with what the actual policy is, which is really tricky and unnerving. There's a variety of reasons for this, but one of the main things is that, getting back to the credibility issue, there's all sorts of people these speeches are meant for, and there's kind of at cross-cutting purposes. You're talking to bureaucratic audiences, domestic audiences, you're talking to Congress, you're trying to signal something to your adversary, but more often than not, you're actually trying to signal to your friends. And so you're telling your enemies, if you do this, I'm going to do these terrible things, but if you behave, I won't do them. But then you're telling your allies, we might do this, and this is, and there's a whole series. When you look at these speeches and how they're laid out, I mean, the McNamara one was the most revealing to me. I'm not even convinced that when he gave the original speech at Athens that he had read it ahead of time, because there's documents about him. It was written by William Kaufman, who was an MIT historian, and the purposes of public pronouncements about nuclear weapons are sometimes serve different purposes. That leads to, the third history, the operational history. What are the weapons? How are they deployed? And in what strategies? Now, this is the stuff that's impossible to get at in the declassified literature. It's really hard. But to a certain extent, you can say, and there was this great oral history with, when he was SACIR with Len Lemnitzer, talking about what I mentioned about flexible response. And he said in the 60s, he banned any of his officers from using the term flexible response because nobody knew what the hell it meant. And he said, McNamara never came to me afterwards and said, all right, now change your nuclear strategy in Europe to do this. And they just went on doing the same thing, right? And there was an operational, you look at where the weapons are, who has them, what do the exercises look like, how are they deployed, and how would they be employed? But even there's a problem, because actually the fourth strand of history, the only one that actually matters, is the way our system works is that the president decides how nuclear weapons are used. And ultimately, the only thing that matters is how presidents think about nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are there both explicitly and implicitly. And this is almost impossible to get at, because there's this famous Dean Acheson goes to President Kennedy early in his administration. He did not like Dean Acheson at all. But this one thing he told him, I think, was advice he took. He said, look, A, develop a view about nuclear weapons and whether you would use them, and B, never tell anyone what those are. And you can understand why you would never tell anyone what those are, because A, pretty much everyone who gets the briefing, you get the sense, says, I never want to have to think about this again. And this actually has consequences for how nuclear weapons strategy gets involved in its own sort of world. In fact, this was another thing I sort of wanted to sort of kid Phil about. I don't know if it was something we were at, Will, but when he was writing the 2002 National Security Strategy, and there's no mention of nuclear weapons in it at all, right? Which, and all the people in the nuclear community are like, could someone actually, we have these nuclear weapons, they're part of our grand strategy. But it's understandable, because we don't really think about what it means. And if you're a president, and after, the first thing that happens, either right before you're inaugurated or right after, you get the briefing of all the unbelievably terrible things that the U.S. has the capability to do. And when you get a sense of looking at what records are available, you could imagine most presidents I just never want to have to think about that ever again. But you can't go out and say that. So all that is a way of saying, there's a strategy, but what questions really matter are sort of really hard to get at. Which leads to the third question. Who can have them? Who's allowed to have nuclear weapons? Now, we just assume that non-proliferation is this, it's like apple pie and baseball. It's sort of understood that, of course, non-proliferation is good. But again, go back to, say, 1950 and ask yourself, well, first of all, the most pressing issue any state faces, the biggest fear it has, is conquest and invasion. And this weapon eliminates that. Second, states compete ruthlessly for any advantage they can have to guarantee their security, especially if it's a technology that will provide protection or power. Third, once a state develops a really good technology, it's very, very hard to keep it a secret, right? Like, you develop the Gatling gun, a battleship, the bow and arrow, chariot, whatever it is, you may try to keep that a secret, but every state has a big incentive to figure out how to get it themselves. And finally, we have very few examples in history of one state being able to tell other states and enforce it that they can't have a weapon, especially a weapon that solves their most basic security issue, right? So if you had said to somebody in 1945 that, and this is why in 1945 Americans were worried about things like international control and working through the UN and trying to figure this out, that the U.S. was going to be able to work to successfully limit the spread of these weapons, they would have said that's impossible. And one of the things, and this is why it's such an interesting history, in 1960, if you looked at national intelligence estimates, and if you said, all right, you're an intelligence agent, you say, who has the capability to build this weapon and who has the interest to build this weapon? And you kind of look at the list of states, it's really large. And in fact, a lot of those states did explore it. Australia, Sweden, Switzerland, Egypt. There were thoughts about Indonesia, Japan. You could go down the list. And if you were to say to yourself, given the way international politics works, given the enormous effect of this technology, given that most states had the scientific, engineering, and financial capabilities to do this, and given that they had the incentive, you would have expected by 2021 that 20, 40, 60, 80 states would have these weapons. That would have been the natural thing. And that didn't happen. And it's actually incredibly important to understand why it was not natural. I've written a piece about it called The Strategies of Inhibition. Basically, the case I make is that the United States, not uncontroversially, and not with the support of everyone, decided to make inhibition, limiting independent nuclear weapons capabilities, a grand strategic objective on par with what I call openness, the liberal economic and political order, and containment. And by the way, inhibition sometimes worked in with containment, somewhat at odds with it. And then when the Cold War ended, it became the primary national security grand strategic interest of the United States. And it was not uncontroversial. People like John McCloy thought it was crazy. Dean Rusk was not for it. And their argument was very simple. You can't limit this technology. And they had an experience with the French. They didn't want the French to have nuclear weapons. So they told the French, we really don't want you to have nuclear weapons. And the French got nuclear weapons, and they were pissed off at the US. So they got the worst of all worlds. They didn't prevent France from developing independent capabilities, and the French were annoyed. So someone like Dean Rusk said, look, this is a fact of life. Let's get ahead of the curve. Let's give nuclear weapons to our potential friends. Let's give them to India. Let's give them to Japan. And this was a live debate. And in the early and mid-60s, there was a debate about what to do. It was very consequential. It's a variety of interesting issues around why the United States did this and decided to do it. But basically, it came up with a variety of grand strategic tools, ranging from coercion and threats, threatening to abandon allies, to norms, telling everyone nuclear weapons were bad, treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but most importantly, these security guarantees, these extended nuclear deterrence guarantees. And there's all sorts of implications there that our non-proliferation friends rarely know. If you go to Australia, if you go to West Germany, you go to Japan and say, you can't have nuclear weapons. We're going to be nice about it. You're going to sign this big international treaty that lots of countries are going to sign, but we don't want you to have it. And they're going to say, well, what do we get out of it? Well, we'll protect you. Well, how are you going to protect us? You're very, very far away. Well, you can rely on our nuclear deterrent. Well, but aren't you seeking strategic stability and mutual vulnerability, which means that nuclear weapons cancel each other out? Say, yeah, we're saying that, but we don't really mean it. In fact, we're developing nuclear capabilities and postures that will still go first, will still focus on counterforce. And there's this weird kind of contradiction in schizophrenia in U.S. nuclear policy, where we say we want strategic stability, which is about embracing mutual vulnerability, but in order to guarantee extended nuclear deterrence, you can't embrace mutual vulnerability. Because if you're West Germany, you say, well, when the Soviet blitzkrieg comes, are you really going to use nuclear weapons if your society is going to be completely destroyed? And you're like, no, we've got a plan for that, right? And it's really complicated. There's been a lot of really good research done on this, some great historical work. A young historian, John Maurer, a political scientist who's done terrific archival work, Brendan Green, a few other people who've looked into all of this. And you say, so why does the U.S. do this? Is it because, peace, love, and making the world safe? One of the interesting things about the United States nuclear weapons is we don't like to be deterred. Right? And so a world with more nuclear weapon states limits our freedom of action. We're a great power. We won't want our freedom of action limited. Nuclear weapons also cancel out other forms of power. The United States, most vibrant economy in the world, great conventional capabilities, soft power. Yet, a country like the Soviet Union, which at best had 40% of American GNP, was able to compete and sometimes looked like it was pushing ahead of the United States in geopolitical competition. So a world without nuclear weapons or with less nuclear weapons is one that the United States often pines for, which leads to the final question. Nuclear weapons, are they good or bad or both? There's two ways of thinking about this question. One is, are nuclear weapons good for the world, and are nuclear weapons good for particular states? Since it's the state I care about is the United States, were they good for the United States? And these aren't necessarily the same thing, right? When Ken Waltz and even some of his sort of followers perhaps less vociferously say they like a world of proliferation, it's because they actually like the idea of the United States being deterred. Right? Which, if you're an American policymaker, no American policymaker thinks that's a good policy. But you could see from a global perspective, if you're not a big fan of U.S. behavior in the world, you want the U.S. behave to be limited, then maybe you would support proliferation. But so on the question of is it good for the world or not, as I said earlier, it solves the problem of conquest of an invasion. On the other hand, there's the problems of accidents, problems of nuclear war happening by miscalculation, which would be an unmitigated disaster. So, we can debate and talk about that. But in terms of the United States, well, first in terms of the overall world, we have not had World War III. The first part of the 20th century was dominated by fully mobilized wars of invasion and conquest, murderous wars. And there's any number of reasons to think that those have gone away, but it's hard to argue that nuclear deterrence didn't have something to do with it. You can't prove it, you can't demonstrate it. I actually think today in 2021, it is less salient. I think that a lot of the forces and factors that drove invasion and conquest in the 19th and 20th century are different now because of demographics, technology, the sources of wealth and power. I think the exception that proves the rule is Russia and Ukraine. Like, who in God's name wants the Donbass, right? How does that add to your power, right? You want to be Singapore, you don't want to be the Donbass. But all that being said, it's clear that nuclear weapons, we've had other kinds of wars, we've certainly had civil wars, but there hasn't been these giant great power wars, and nuclear weapons are certainly clearly part of that. That being said, that has happened under a shadow of terrifying fear. Deterrence is based upon, and all the good things that come from deterrence is based upon basing your strategy on the possibility of something absolutely unthinkable, something absolutely horrific. And there's a question there, is that really healthy in the long run? You can think about some of the consequences that has had culturally, socially, politically. I've alluded to the fact that to a certain extent it's both based on something horrific, and also there's a bit of lying that goes on about it, even though people aren't aware of it. And this is one of these things I always wonder about. It's also, we have an international nuclear weapons order that is inherently unfair. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Order is based on a set of states saying we have them and no one else can have them. And it's worked. But you can imagine in a lot of parts of the world, people are saying, wait, what did we sign up for? And there's all this talk about these Article 6 obligations the U.S. and the Soviets had to disarm. The U.S. and the Soviets didn't take this seriously at all. And in fact, they can turn around and say, there's a lot less nuclear weapons. We have a lot less nuclear weapons than we did in 1968, so we're meeting our part of the bargain. But so there's a big debate about this. And if we were having this conversation in Vienna or in Wellington or in Jakarta or Lagos, people would be talking about the UN treaty to ban nuclear weapons, which I think has been signed by over 80 states, which is more or less an international treaty to say nuclear weapons are illegal. No one in the US really thinks about this very much, but there is certainly outside of the nuclear weapons states, which is the majority of the states, although not the majority of the population, who say, it's not clear that the benefits of these weapons are worth it. And that's a big debate that's going on. In the US case, it's a little more nuanced. On the one hand, nuclear weapons allow the United States to defend far-flung territories that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. The commitments that the United States was able to make to protect Western Europe and parts of East Asia would have been highly unlikely in a non-nuclear era. The US does not have a tradition of having fully mobilized conventional forces sent abroad. It's expensive. There's a whole variety of reasons to think that would have been difficult to do. And from that token, the United States certainly benefited by there being no World War III and actually being able to provide security around the world. On the other hand, it's come at some great cost. Part of this grand strategy, as I've indicated, was for the United States to make itself highly vulnerable, its homeland highly vulnerable in a way that it might not have otherwise been, in order to sort of pursue its grand strategic interests in a nuclear age. Also, nuclear weapons, as I indicated earlier, if you're the United States, say in 1960, 40% of the world's GNP, you've got incredible conventional military capabilities, you've got amazing technology, you've got a lot of freedom of action in the world. But in a nuclear weapons world, states that are far smaller or far less impressive than other forms of power can actually get your attention. I mean, I always like to imagine, going back to like Secretary of State John Hay, who thought about East Asia a lot, said, you know what? The United States for 20 years is going to be obsessed with North Korea. What are you talking about, right? The only reason we care about what is essentially a gangster state is because they have nuclear weapons capabilities, right? And you can try to ignore it, but one of the problems with nuclear weapons is, even though they're instruments of national power, they have global consequences. Right? You can't get around it. And so you can't just say, I'm just going to turn away and not worry about what North Korea is doing with their nuclear weapons, because they will do something to make you pay attention. Just in the same way as if there was a nuclear exchange in South Asia, the United States would inevitably be pulled in. And by the way, as Vipin Rang has demonstrated, some nuclear weapon states, like Israel earlier on and Pakistan, developed these weapons as a way to pull the United States into conflicts that they wouldn't otherwise want to have. So on that side, the record is somewhat mixed. So we're in this very strange place right now for the United States thinking about nuclear weapons. There are those who believe that we should try to capture the good with the bad. If you were to say, there's a big debate about what does strategic stability mean. All strategic stability means is like, how do we get the good stuff from nuclear weapons without any of the bad stuff? The good stuff's deterrence. The bad stuff is the incentive to use them first in a surprise attack, miscalculation, mistakes like that. And so this is kind of the standard conventional view. It's a very Washington view where you seek arms control, you try to modernize your forces, but you don't see the attempt to develop a first strike capability. There are others who believe that this sort of view in arms control is inadequate, that nuclear weapons are bad either for moral, political, or strategic reasons, and that we should seek their elimination. And by the way, this is not just a kind of a left progressive view. The real way this view was made popular was in 2006 and 2007, when four key policymakers, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn, wrote a Wall Street Journal opinion piece calling for the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. And I can tell you that while there were a variety of motivations among the four of them, it was not solely because nuclear weapons were dangerous. There was also this sense that a world with nuclear weapons actually, by limiting America's freedom of action, does not serve America's interests. And of course, Barack Obama gave a speech in Prague calling for their eventual elimination. And as I mentioned earlier, the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which we oppose, the United States, has been signed by 86 countries and ratified by 54. So where does this, in conclusion, where does this leave us all? Basically, one of the things and the reason why, even though I keep trying to get out of the nuclear business, I keep getting pulled in, is that how you think about those four questions that I laid out and all those issues, deterrence, disarmament, arms control, they're actually shaped by your larger views of how the world works. Your theories on agency and causality, what makes for war and peace, what makes for stability and instability. In other words, nuclear weapons and thinking about nuclear weapons, no matter how consequential they are, cannot be separated from thinking about the worlds of grand strategy and international politics. And unfortunately, most of the people who look at nuclear weapons and study these issues don't connect them. They are, even though they are a transformative technology, they are still instruments of statecraft for states trying to operate in an international political system. And so you can't just study nuclear weapons separate from that. You actually have to think about what are states trying to do with these things. And it's understandable that we study, or that most people study nuclear weapons as its own subject. But one of the things, and I'll end up with this, that I want to return to, that I began with, I never wanted to be a historian of nuclear weapons, and I've been trying to get out of this business for 15 years. But one of the things, I'm a historian of American foreign relations and international politics. But one of the things I realized was I could not understand American grand strategy and American foreign policy without understanding nuclear weapons. And I couldn't understand nuclear weapons without understanding American foreign policy and international relations. And that's how I got into this incredibly interesting set of issues that are ultimately, and fortunately, and hopefully forever unanswerable. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.